laying down and dying like on the sidewalk. And what had happened was people were scared of AIDS. They didn't know. They called it the gay plague. I'm not going to mince words. They called it the gay plague. The government wouldn't help. Churches wouldn't help. Even doctors who took an oath to say, I will help you, would not help these people. Dennis Peron helped these people. And I want everybody to remember that Prop 215 is called the Compassionate Use Act. Just want to marinate on that, the Compassionate Use Act. It's not about cannabis, it's about compassion. And that's what Dennis really embodied. I'm going to have several speakers come up to talk about him, and before they come up here, I really want to thank them. We've got his brother, Jeff, his caretaker, Daniel, one of his dearest friends, and the first medical cannabis patient, Wayne Justman. And I want to thank you because you shared him with us. And I can't imagine it was an easy life having Dennis as a brother, somebody who put his life on the line every day for people he didn't even know and got shot to save the lives of people that he didn't know. And so I know that we're always honoring Dennis, but I want to honor you guys too, and the sacrifice that you guys gave for us, for this community, and for these people. Thank you. So thank you for sharing his life with all of us. I appreciate that. So I would like to call up first Wayne Justman. Again, he's the very first medical cannabis patient in California, which means the first medical cannabis patient in America. And so he's going to say a few words.
Dennis was here a couple months ago at your event, and he enjoyed it. What he enjoyed was sharing your enthusiasm for what each of you are doing. I don't know if I had a choice when I got involved with medical cannabis. They diagnosed me HIV positive 30 years ago. I thought I was a dead man. Everybody else was. But for some reason, I'm still here at 73 years, and I'm going to make damn sure that anyone and everyone that wants to have access to cannabis should have access to cannabis. And I want to make damn sure we can give it away. What is so difficult about giving this plant and sharing it with somebody else? At my dispensary at 350 Trocadero, so 20 years ago, and then Dennis's dispensary, 1444 Market Street, we shared. See, because maybe you're not going to be there next week because you died. Okay? And maybe you're not going to be here next week because you're in the hospital. See, we had to deal with that all the time. Not only our own struggles, but those of others. And the reason why we could do it was because of the word compassion. If you don't have empathy for someone else, what the hell kind of life do you have? It's got to be empty. It has to be empty. You need fulfillment, and the fulfillment is caring about one another. And we did a lot of caring about one another at 1444 Market Street. And I had the unique pleasure, the absolutely unique pleasure of having this man as my friend. I remember when we used to go from San Francisco to the farm in Lower Lake County, we'd go by grape fields. You know what we thought? Someday that's going to be cannabis. Candace and I, someday that's going to be cannabis. Don't let yourself down. Don't let folks like me who use it for medical reasons, not just adult or recreational use, don't forget about us. Because I know this, we'll never forget about you. Thank you very much for everything.
So let's not forget about them. I want to bring up Dennis's brother Jeffrey to say a few words.
First, I'd like to say I want to we appreciate and we're mildly overwhelmed with the responses I've gotten in the last week and a half. I was asked to say something about a memorial service that we're going to have for Dennis on March 11th from 5 to 10 at Cafe Flora, Market Adobe. Part of the street closed down. And we do have a GoFundMe page to help pay for that. And I ask you to speak of that. Just to make things confusing, there are two GoFundMe pages. The other one is for a project that we started with Dennis before he passed away, Canna. And we had started that before Dennis passed away. So there will be a calendar available for anyone. So that's all I would have to say about that. I'm reminded that our existence here is really temporary. I got a sharp reminder of that today. But if we're lucky, we can make our mark on the world. My brother did make a mark on the world. Not very long ago, I was speaking to a childhood friend of mine. He told me, and maybe I didn't see all this then, that he always looked up to my brother as a hero. You know, I'm the youngest of 5 boys. Okay? I had 4 older brothers. Dennis was my second oldest brother. Now, to my brothers, I was just probably the annoying little brother. And my friend Tommy was the little brother's annoying friend. But Tommy reminded me of that. He always thought of Dennis as a hero. That first, that he helped protect us in the schoolyard against some of the bullies. I didn't really remember that as much as he remembered that. And how he went to Vietnam and that he looked up to the hero and eventually when he came back, that he would always bring back the good pop. Because in New York, we wouldn't have that. And it was very touching to hear that. The literally hundreds, if not 1,000 or more responses I have gotten in the last week and a half or so. And I have looked at every single one, by the way, even if I didn't respond in that way. It's very, very touching. My brother was a very compassionate man, he was a very kind man, he was a very generous man, sometimes to a fault, he was a generous man. And I have received more than I could count people offering to help. And believe me, we have reached out and accepted some of this help. But my brother, who was a very kind and compassionate man, would tell you to go help someone else and share a joint with them. So I'm going to say to you all now, in the name of my brother's legacy, to help somebody and share a joint with them.
Selling candles, so here's that $100 to go towards the party on the 11th.
Thank you, Jeff. I realized, like, I kind of assumed that everybody knows who Dennis Peron was. I shouldn't assume that. Just a quick crash
figured I'd give him 100.
Primary and other people who, in the mid-90s, pushed through medical cannabis. And the reason we have medical cannabis and even the medical cannabis industry is because of Dennis Peron. You know, he was the one he brought medical cannabis to San Francisco first, and then California eventually caught on, and he literally changed the world, because I don't know if we would have ever had medical cannabis. I think we might have gone right to regulation, or right to adult use legalization, but I don't know if what was that? Almost said it right. I don't know if we would have had cannabis recognized as a medicine without him. So I guess I just assumed everybody knows what he did. So if you don't know who Dennis Peron was, go home and Google him. There's tons of articles about him. It's so important for us. We can't really go where we want to go without knowing where we've come from. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Daniel, who was a dear, dear friend of Dennis and was his caretaker for the last 7 years. So thank you for loving our hero and caring for him. And we love you. Thank you.
Following that, it's kind of hard to not to be compelled to go into all of these, all the stories, just everything I've heard from him and his family and everything. I've only had the pleasure to know him in his retirement in the last 20 years. So to see a man that was to a lot of God, a savior to most, to see him in his retirement and still helping people, set up a bed and breakfast, a bed and breakfast that, it turned into an international bed and breakfast that kind of educated people of marijuana and how in one little city in our country we're kind of getting away with it, and, as Dennis said, it took him 30 years to get it legalized, and I think today being the 64 passed, even though he's not a fan of it because it's really restrictive on a lot of people, and God, we can get pulled over, for smoking now, which we only would get in trouble if we had a bag, they wouldn't say we were stoned, so that part kind of sucks. But working on it. But to say one thing, his mission was compelled by the death of a lover, AIDS hit the city really hard, and he found that weed made it so he could cope, it's just easier to deal with your pain, you could, I don't like chuckle about bullshit or anything. But it still came down to this one word, and he said, all these years, all these bills, all these, so much politics trying to get this stuff done, it took one word, medical. And even though his passion was kind of, all kind of just fed by this love for a lost one, all being medical. It's funny that it was just this one word that it was what it truly was for. And that's like he says, even though we have recreational pot, even if you're smoking it just to relax, it's medical. You're relaxing, That's right. So, but the only reason I actually was going to say something. So, seeing him, being his friend in the later years and everything, he actually said something 3 weeks ago that was really touching. The girls that are putting this calendar together for him, it was, to get him more spending money at the end, maybe, do some fun shit or whatever. One of the girls brought him some money, and she said, "I'm sorry, I wish it was more. We have to sell these calendars. The money's coming." And he said, if I have $20, I'm rich. For a man that I think the DEA had occupied the building across from the 4-story. He used to call it the 4-story felony. 1444 Market. They said something, I always remembered the story going, it was $49 million a year that they had figured. They just figured every person bought at least an eighth. Imagine. God knows, people are buying pounds and everything. So God knows the true money behind it, But it's like, I'm sure if, knowing people that have been so much in the media or have done so much around the world, like, I couldn't imagine, like, living with Mother Teresa or something, But it would almost be kind of the same, because they're not like an actor or something that have got all this money for doing just some simple talent. It's because you've made such a difference with just your heart. That's all that's you. So in his retirement, he was still doing that. People from around the world have done it for in the last 20 years that I've been around. They always stop and you can stay on his couch. Always. You can always stop by the castle. You always have a warm place to stay, a hot shower and a nice meal. Like, it was always that way. So even to the end, for a man that had so much money, it always went out to him back, right to everyone else. So it was an honor to be his friend and to help him at the end. So I don't know what's going with my parents. Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're gonna call on Granddaddy Mike to round it all out. He's a longtime friend of Dennis, and Dennis would always say, Granddaddy Mike always has the best weed. So make friends with this guy if you're not already.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for all coming out. It's so great to see you all. Dennis would have loved to see this kind of a community and this kind of an event right now. So, insofar as you've all gotten yourself here, I want to just make sure that everybody realizes you're all Dennis Peron activists.
No Peronettes.
And we would not be here. We've all told it before, but literally, we would not be in this room right now if it was not for Dennis. Okay, and if you don't appreciate that fact, like we said before, educate yourself about this man. This man was a wonderful man. I met Dennis lived at 17th and Dolores, and I lived at 15th and Dolores, and we both walked our dogs in Dolores Park. For 10 years, when I knew Dennis as another dog walker who smoked weed, right? And neither one of us acknowledged that we were both in the cannabis business. That's how underground we were. Right? So I was just another dog walker who had, Dennis thought, really good weed. And we would just sit on a park bench and get stoned and watch our dogs play. Dennis, I'm in a position where I can tell you some things that you're not going to find on Wikipedia, and you're not going to find out there in some of the other statements. So I'm going to tell you some skinny stuff. All right? You want to hear some skinny stuff about Dennis?
What's the skinny green?
Dennis Peron, when he went over to Vietnam, he enlisted in the Air Force to avoid being drafted in the Army. I thought the Air Force would be safer. Ended up spending 2 years over in Vietnam. On his way over, he was in San Francisco, and he fell in love with the place. Thought it was great. Vowed that if he survived the Vietnam War, he was coming back to San Francisco. Well, he came back and he brought 2 pounds of weed with him, right? And he came back as a proud gay man. And those 2 things changed history in San Francisco. Dennis was a very complex guy. He was all heart, he loved everybody. He would engage with everybody. And he wanted to help everybody. Dennis ended up, after a few years, settling into a restaurant, finally owned a restaurant, ran it out on Castro Street. Very successful restaurant. In the back room, gay man on Castro Street running a restaurant. In the back room, he's slinging weed. Right? So, and arguably he was the biggest dealer in the Castro district for at least a decade. So there were people in the cannabis industry and the cannabis movement that knew Dennis during that time as, a very successful high-volume drug dealer. We were talking the other day about what we think post hoc was really happening. And we came up with 100 pounds a week, Wayne, right?
About 140 figure.
But 140.
Yeah.
And when we talked about it, we realized that's what he would admit to. Right? If you knew Dennis, you realized he had to acknowledge some of it just because so many people knew him and knew he had good weed, right? But Dennis was an outspoken activist. He was a courageous man. He was arrested 27 times. 27 times arrested for cannabis offenses. Tried 7 times. Convicted 4 times. Spent a year in prison, right? And he was a smaller stature, hippie-looking gay guy, right? Who was a drug pusher. And so he was violently abused by the police when they arrested him. He was persecuted while he was incarcerated. He was beat up, right? He was intimidated, he was threatened. And of course, the man just wanted him to shut the fuck up and stop doing this. When he found out, when the AIDS epidemic came and his compassion kicked in, and he and Brownie Mary started providing brownies to people to help them with their suffering, Dennis never hesitated to know what was right for the people and what was right for the cannabis. It was as though he was a representative of the cannabis, and his job was just to make sure that those that needed it most got it. Yep. And so he gave away thousands and thousands of dollars of cannabis, right? He lost his home, he lost his job, he lost all of his money, and it happened many times. And what separates Dennis perhaps from the rest of us is that he always got back up. He always bounced back, right? He never stopped, right? You need to understand that as we continue on integrating cannabis into our culture here, this man was the root of medical marijuana, not only in San Francisco, but in the state of California, in the nation of the United States, and all over the world. Many people realize we would not have gotten this far with regulation if we hadn't had the step of medical in the interim. Now, I want to let you know there will be some controversy about what Dennis stood for, what he agreed with, etc. I want to let you know Dennis believed in tearing down the walls, right? The walls of incarceration, the walls of misunderstanding, the walls of ignorance that separate us from each other, right? Tear down the walls, free the weed, right? Free the weed and, release all the POWs, the weed POWs. There should not be anyone in jail for pot. Dennis ardently believed, was committed lifelong to those principles. The compassion program, yes, everybody who needs it needs to have access to cannabis, right? And if you're not participating in that or contributing to that, then you are not fully living up to his legacy. So it's time for all of us to recommit. It's time for all of us to, frankly, I realize that no 100 of us in this room are going to be able to carry the mantle that Dennis carried for this industry, right? So we're all going to need to recommit. Now, Dennis would also, one thing he wouldn't have liked about this event is that we can't smoke weed.
Yeah.
I just want to throw that out there. Dennis, by now here, Dennis would have found a place outside, close by, where he would stand and smoke a joint, right? I mean, or a pipe or something. But, I just wanted to say, Dennis was for, smoking the flower. But, as we move forward, cannabis is medicine, right? We are all activists, right? We need to all provide compassionate access to everyone. Cannabis needs to be descheduled, right? Yes. Cannabis, we just need to take it out. And these are all the kinds of things that Dennis, would have supported. In that spirit, we have a pop-up event, all right? On 2/15, in commemoration of Prop 215, right? So that's Thursday, next Thursday. okay, next Thursday, a pop-up event in San Francisco in a public park where we're gonna just have a smoke out. Okay, we're all gonna get together in the spirit of Dennis, and we're gonna have some civil disobedience. Right? We're gonna stand united, and we're gonna say, look, we believe this ought to be legal, right? And we believe that Dennis thinks this ought to be legal. So we're gonna act as if it's legal, right? Do you really wanna put all of us in a cage for doing this? You know? So I encourage you all to, be brave, stand up, never quit, and, remember Dennis Peron.